The mysterious stranger I heard about my entire life, swinging the bat like Jackie Robinson saving you, Mama and Uncle George was me. This book belongs to our family, and together we're going to use this book to protect our family. I'm Chris Piping,
And I'm Eddie Webb.
and today on Genreless, we delve into Lovecraft Country. A rat done bit my sister Nell, and Whitey's on the moon. Her face and arms began to swell, and Whitey's on the moon. I can't pay no doctor's bill, but Whitey's on the moon. 10 years from now, I'll be paying still while Whitey's on the moon. The man just upped my rent last night because Whitey's on the moon. No hot water, no toilets, no lights, but Whitey's on the moon. I wonder why he's upping me because Whitey's on the moon. I was already paying 50 a week with Whitey on the moon. Taxes taking my whole damn check. Junkies making me a nervous wreck. The price of food is going up, and as if all this shit wasn't enough, a rat done bit my sister Nell with Whitey on the moon. Her face and arms began to swell, but Whitey's on the moon. Was all the money I made last year for Whitey on the moon? How come there ain't no money here? Whitey's on the moon. I just about had my fill of Whitey on the moon. I think I'll send them doctor's bill airmail special to Whitey on the moon. Like to,
Woo!
to thank you for eating our spoken word corner for the podcast this week.
Yes,
And,
yes.
and on drums, we have Mr. Eddie Webb.
But I debated giving you a drum beat, and I just realized that that would just be awful, so I decided not to.
Well, the reading was probably awful too, but you know what? Some
That's
days
just
you
quite
just got to
good.
do it.
It's quite good. You had a good rhythm there.
I appreciate your fake praise to keep me on beat, sir. So we're here today to talk about Lovecraft Country, the TV series.
Yes.
Um, this is going to be a very difficult and nuanced topic to discuss. Anyone that knows me knows that I have a interesting relationship with the book, the TV show, and the racist in chief himself, Lovecraft.
hmm Yeah. I mean, you do. Just kind of acknowledging that is a very complicated relationship.
I've written some work about it that's in Harlem Unbound, and I think some of it's over the internet. If you really want my full opinions on it, I would say go read those and check those out. I think they're well worth the read. But I'm not going to go into full details here, other than he was an ardent racist who was even bad for his time. And I know that people say that, well, towards the end of his life, he started to regret some of the things he's done. That is a whole other conversation about when you have whatever power you have and what you choose to use it for. And the work that was written does not reflect that, and its impact doesn't reflect that.
Right. Yeah.
And for all you people out there that are writing Lovecraft material, this one is just for you. That if you're buying a book by someone that's writing Lovecraft material and the entire team is primarily white cis people, or they don't have any of the marginalized groups that are highly impacted by that work negatively, I would advise you to not buy that, as that supports them and whatever agenda they're trying to move forward.
hmm Yeah. I mean, for my part, the only thing I can kind of add to, because I'm equally very down on Lovecraft, but for me it comes from the ableism mental health perspective, because a lot of Lovecraft systems slash pastiches also extremely badly presents mental health.
Hmm.
On top of everything, also if your system talks about sanity and how losing it makes you a terrible person, maybe reconsider your life choices.
And so that is it for the racist in chief himself, unless you have anything else you'd like to add about that person.
I think we've given him more than enough coverage.
All right. So let's talk about Lovecraft Country briefly, the book, and then in depth in the TV series. So for the book itself, I'm going to point out that I have an issue with the book, also
Oh,
because it is a white man writing about black struggle and profiting off of it unbelievably successfully to get your own TV series. I think he's going to come out with a second book, and that bothers me intrinsically as a person that is going through that struggle, to have someone else profit so much off of not necessarily my story, but something that is potentially my story.
Mhm.
I don't know if he had sensitivity readers or anything else, but I have an intrinsic problem with that at the heart of it.
Okay, I was unaware of that, but I can totally see why. It's one thing. When we talked about this before, it's one thing to say that you can only talk present characters that reflect your own identity. I don't think that is fair. But when your entire book revolves around identity that's not yours, that's now we're getting into rough territory.
And it's not Matt Ruff and friends. It is Matt Ruff wrote
Right,
this book.
right.
So bothered considering someone that when I make a book, if I'm telling a lot of different stories, I bring on those people to have them be part of that process. And if they want to, I let them write that piece themselves to make sure that voice there is authentic and it is representative of at least a certain percentage of that group of people. Because no people are a monolith. So
No,
let's just put that out now before someone says shenanigans. And that is important to me intrinsically, and that is not here in this piece of work.
mm,
Anything else you want to talk about the book?
I never read the book. I did, to be blunt, I didn't even know the book existed until the show came out. So
We travel in different circles, my friend. I am in
we
the
do.
mythos circle. You're in more of that occult circle, which let me tell you now, the mythos has more power than the occult, but that's a larger discussion we could have for later.
Well, yeah, that's fair. But I mean, like, yes, you're deeply entrenched in this area. I, on the other hand, am at this moment reading volume two of a 7 volume series of Doctor Who criticism through the lens of alchemy and occultism. So we have slightly different tastes in this regard, yes.
Love it. All right. Lovecraft Country, the TV show. If you followed me online, you'll likely notice that I have not talked really about this show. I commented I was watching it. I commented about a cool few beautiful pieces of scenery, but I have not delved into it. And there is a specific reason about for that. Is I've noticed that if I say something that has been used and weaponized and used against other people, so that has made me very cautious for things that I say and I put out in social media. Which you think, well, that can't be true. You post all the time on social media. I do post a lot, but I'm posting it about the book I'm reading. I'm posting the amazing cup of coffee, or occasionally that $500 bottle of scotch that I somehow got that I am doing my Gollum impersonation for.
Important,
Or I'm
important
talking
stuff to talk
about the
about.
industry. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying that $500 scotch is very important to talk about. Yes.
I think so. Or I'm talking about the industry on a whole and how we can try to change it and make it better.
Right.
I will frequently not comment on black or marginalized media that I have a nuanced opinion or take on because social media likes hot takes and I don't do hot takes.
Right.
And
Uh,
having said all that, I will say that the good parts of Lovecraft Country outweigh the bad parts, but we are going to definitely delve into those bad parts. So up front, at the start of the podcast, if you've not seen Lovecraft Country, you should go watch it. Watch it. You should give Misha Green all the kudos in the world for making this show.
mhm. Also, I suppose we should briefly recap. We talked about it in Loki, but we blah blah blah. Majors may have caused some problems. Blah blah blah.
And at time of recording, the way we can be so flip it is because it has not been decided, and the court dates just keep getting pushed out further and further.
Right, right. So we literally have nothing more to say that we didn't say on the Loki episode. But he's the star in this too, so I want to at least acknowledge it. Yes, we're aware. We're still aware.
The show itself. I'm going to talk about some of the controversy briefly. First one I want to start with is it is inherently a piece dealing with colorism, and it does not address colorism at all. And we'll go into more about colorism as we go through the episodes.
Okay.
I want to state that. Any comments before I move on to the next point?
Um, I would say mostly for the audience, but also a little bit for me. Maybe it's worth defining. I mean, I know objectively what colorism is, but in this context, what are we talking about?
So color. There's so many ways I could describe it now. Back in the day, one of the things they did for black people is they had a paper bag test, which is if you were lighter than a paper bag, they would let you into places because you were close enough to passing as white. If you're darker, they would do dubiously bad and cruel things to you.
Mhm.
So it goes back to the concept of passing privilege. And it's something that is used for that white people have used against marginalized groups to also cause infighting amongst those groups where you are light enough for us to think that you could potentially be us. So we'll let you do this so we can all have another class that we consider lower to persecute. And
Mhm.
so that's how you keep that strife going throughout. And an example of colorism in the show is going to be Letty is the lightest black skinned person in the show. And Letty is constantly put as an antagonist against all the darker skinned people. And there's almost a virginal Mary aspect added to her character throughout the journey of the show at the expense of all the other darker skinned characters.
Okay. Um, would it be
Additionally,
also accurate? Oh, I was just to say, make sure I understand this correctly as well. One thing I had noticed, and I want to make sure I'm accurately perceiving this. She was also very much explicitly presented as the quote unquote attractive slash sexy character, and the fact that she was light as skin, is that another component of this as well?
yes, but that goes into colorism and then that goes into equivalently a form of like body shaming.
Okay.
Because even when I first watched the show in the first 5 minutes, I think that Ruby and Letty's character should have been switched, like hands down.
Hmm. Hmm.
But to add on to the colorism bit, there was also a scandal that came out that one of the extras was a lighter skinned black person, and they had that person darken their skin to be in photos and other things. Anything else you want to discuss about this?
Do we know the composition of the writing room on this one?
I do not. I know that Misha Green, a black woman, was the lead writer, producer, and driving force behind it.
Right. Right. Okay.
Then we're going to touch on this is an episode we did not cover, but it is incredibly important that we discuss it at the top of the show. Is that they brought in for like a 5 minute window, they brought in a resurrected an indigenous person and they misused the terminology, I believe, of a two spirited person. And they had that person be overly sexualized. And then within 5 minutes, they had the black gay character, Montrose, kill that character
Hmm.
because he didn't want them to tell secrets to other people. Just kill that character. So within 5 minutes doing that. And there's more that you can read about online if you want to, but as that's not my background, I'm going to tell you that it exists and tell you that it's important. I think you should read up on it yourselves.
I'm chuckling because we're starting to move into, but besides that, how was the play, Mrs. Lincoln territory?
Well, anything else about those you want to discuss?
No. I think you've adequately covered all those topics. And this is, you're right. This is a complicated show to cover for a lot of reasons. So it's better to kind of get the stuff out ahead of time so we can just go through the episode talking about the show itself.
Mm-hmm. I think those were the main points I wanted to cover regarding that before we move into the show proper. The show itself aired, I want to say, in around 2020, which was dropped during the height of the one of the spikes for the Black Lives Matter movement at that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you remember those, but this show dropped then, so it was critically well received that first episode because how well done it was, and given the moment when it aired.
Yep.
That critical reception waned through the course of the show from the issues that we discussed, and also the show focused more on the trauma aspect of things
Mm-hmm.
and making the trauma plot points than actually delving into them. For instance, I will say Watchmen dealt with trauma, but it didn't. It made it a specific reason to deal with that trauma, and not just sort of a catch that you'd use to spike up something to grab attention to display the trauma, and then not follow through with it. For
Right.
Watchmen, we had that legacy of pain that traveled throughout the character, and we followed a character to the end that had to deal with all of it. For this, they found specific black, horrible atrocities and used them and then moved away from them, but didn't actually deal or cope with it. For instance, I will say that in an episode that we didn't cover, they had Christina, who has immortality, pay people to basically kill her so that she could try to understand the trauma and horror that Emmett Till went through when he was murdered.
Hmm.
Like at that point, I was done with the show when I first watched it. Like that was,
Hmm.
and if you don't know who Emmett Till is, I'm going to tell you to go look it up because this is history that you should know, and I'm not going to delve into that.
Right.
And if you still don't want to read about it, there's a movie that came out, I want to say last year, that no one went and saw. That was an amazing piece about a movie about the mother and the choices she made to display the body, which had not been done before.
Mm.
Called Till, that no one went and saw.
Absolutely. It's and I mean it in some ways. When we first, I mentioned this in passing, and turns out erroneously when we covered Watchmen, but it is an interesting moment in time, that 2019 2020 moment, because in some ways they are companion pieces, and in other ways they're very different. So at one point, I idly debated talking to Chris about maybe doing these in sequence to compare them, but I think it's better to put some distance between them for a lot of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Because really, from our mandate as a podcast, the idea of let's take things that are lumped into a genre, put them together, and then talk about how they're actually not really all that related that much. So it wouldn't have made sense, because at that point, then the genre becomes black trauma, and that's just frankly not a conversation I think any of us want to have. So instead, let's talk about Watchmen in the context of superheroes. Talk about this in the context of horror. It makes more sense.
And at the time, it was a almost brilliant idea, which it shouldn't have been so brilliant and revolutionary, to tell a horror mythos story historically focused around black characters. That should not have been as groundbreaking as it was, but that goes to a larger conversation about the racism in Hollywood and how it's
Mm-hmm.
been unfair treatment
Mm-hmm.
and still is unfair treatment. And once again, I would say that we support the writers on this show and all the strikes currently going on.
Yep.
If you don't have anything else, I'm going to jump directly into the show.
Let's do it.
Episode 1, Season 1, Sundown. Korean War veteran Atticus Freeman traveled to Chicago after receiving a letter from his missing father, Montrose, inviting him to discover his family's legacy in Ardham, Massachusetts. Atticus, his uncle George, who writes a green book style travel guide, and his friend Letitia fucking Lewis set off on a road trip to Devon County, Massachusetts. A group of murderous white men chase them out of a town they stop in, but they escape thanks to the intervention of an unknown silver car driven by a mysterious white woman. Later, they encounter the racist sheriff of Devon County, who torments them in a sundown race in the Sundown County. Just after sunset, the sheriff's deputies force the trio into the woods with the intent of killing them, but the entire group is attacked by vicious monsters they believe to be Shoggoths. For all you Lovecraftian fans out there, don't at me, because you could say they're not Shoggoths, but they're Shoggoths in the show, so suck it. Atticus, George, and Letty fight their way out while the police officers perish. The Shoggoths are called away by a mysterious noise. In the morning, the trio stumbles out of the woods to find an enormous mansion where they're welcomed by a mysterious white man named William, who greets them warmly. Boom, boom, boom.
Um,
The budget spent on this was fantastic,
oh God, yeah,
hands down,
it is. It's a
beautiful.
lush episode.
Oh, and I we'll go into maybe beats. I'm not sure we want to cover it because after the initial talk, I'm a little in that headspace, so I'm working my way around. the opening scene of the war in black and white that transitions to color
Hmm.
was spectacular. Like that's how I envisioned some of the trenches in World War One when I'm writing Cthulhu stuff or mythos related material for some of the soldiers, and when they sort of pop out, and to get the weird pulp bit for the alien coming down and Jackie Robinson destroying Cthulhu. Oh, that is my favorite meme of all time.
It's one thing I definitely want to say about the show is that it was confident. Maybe at times, as we talked about, shouldn't have been as confident as it thought it was. Um, but to start off a show like this, it's like, no, you're going to see some weird shit, and we're telling you right up front, you're going to see some weird shit. And so there's a whole lot of what the hell is going on here. But you're right, it is straight out of the weird pulp tradition, and this show is absolutely channeling that in ways and continually reinforcing it in ways that are just frankly amazing.
And here I want to take a beat because I read a lot of reviews when it first came out because that's what you do,
Hmm.
and I saw certain group of reviewers complaining that it wasn't Lovecraft enough, that they
What?
didn't know that they didn't understand the source material and all these other complaints. And then I was like you, but then I'm also thinking that it's not based on Lovecraft's work.
Right,
It's based on Matt Ruff's work, who based his work on an interpretation he wanted to tell of Lovecraftian work.
right.
So there's multiple layers of distillation, and to hear that to be one of the key complaints, and people say they're not going to watch the show, also led me to believe there are other reasons they're not going to watch the show.
Hmm.
Possibly the leads of the show.
Right.
And I lurk
Yeah,
in a
I
lot of
mean,
Cthulhu forums too.
well, I mean, and then let's be honest. A lot of fandoms have their shibboleths, which are basically you have to be X canon pure enough to ride this ride. And you and I've talked about through this whole podcast that a lot of times people of color have a higher bar to clear. And so yeah, it's frustrating, but also specifically the mythos is a really weird place to draw that line because we have and probably will continue until we die give Lovecraft a lot of stick, but he was perfectly happy to let people use his shit in a wide variety of ways.
He was like
Um,
in books where I talk about everything in his racism, I do compliment the fact that he's willing to let other white writers engage
right,
with his mythos material willy nilly, however they want it. Like that is enormous. That is unbelievable. And it was
right.
some
So,
people that came in after him that started putting copyrights on stuff.
yes, exactly. I have a very complicated relationship with August Derleth as a result of that. But brief digression. My complicated relationship is that he copyrighted a bunch of mythos stuff, and also copyrighted a bunch of stuff that were obviously Sherlockian pastiches. So while he did a lot of really good writing, he also had no problem stealing other people's IPs, filing up serial numbers, then claiming it as his own and protecting it. So that's complicated.
Mm-hmm.
But um, uh, that said, the Solar Pond stories are actually really good, and you should read them. But uh, the weird idea of having a purity test for, of all things, the fucking Cthulhu mythos is deeply weird to me. That's kind of like saying this Doctor Who fan fiction isn't accurate enough to Doctor Who canon.
As a defender of canons, I am in utter agreement with you about that though. Like I am a staunch believer that canon is important, but I also understand that canon changes for mediums that you're in. And
Right.
sometimes you have to alter it to make whatever it is you're doing engaging to get new audiences to keep it going.
Right. The other thing that's weird about that argument, which goes into actually the episode we're watching here, is that when mythos stories are good, and I have the personal opinion that most of the good ones are not actually written by Lovecraft, but when they are good, is they use the mythos sparingly, right? If it's constantly in your face, it stops being scary.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if it doesn't connect to a human experience, it's not scary. It's just an intellectual exercise. Uh, and this absolutely nails that, right? This episode is like, let's talk about extremely human horrifying experience and then link that to the mythos, and it elevates. Elevates a very strange word here. I recognize that, but it intensifies, better word, both sides of it. The Shoggoth is now scarier, and the human horror is now scarier as a result. By saving it to the very end of this episode, and but teasing it constantly and going, we're almost there, is frankly the right way to go. To jump ahead slightly, one of my favorite moments of that is the gag of my father was in Arkham, and it's like Arkham doesn't exist. No, this letter is no, it's Artem. Oh, it's like it's a great little moment of watching Atticus kind of slip into his own head about the mythos, and then another character going, no, you're kind of overreacting, and then of course later on Atticus is proven correct because we know how these kinds of stories go, but it's a moment of delayed gratification. Horror in a lot of ways is a lot like comedy in the sense if you want to delay that moment as long as possible because it lands better when it does. So there's not enough mythos stuff in this. Fuck you. There's exactly the right amount of mythos stuff in this.
And I like it also because it is telling of what's going to happen throughout the show. Like that is someone
Mm-hmm.
that's thought about how the show is going to work and put out plot beats throughout it, and they're sprinkled so they're not heavy. Not all of them are heavy handed. Like for instance, with I'll in case I don't remember to talk about it when we get there, but Jackie Robinson and the Bat
Yep.
saving the day becomes important in episode 9 out of a 10 episode
Mm-hmm.
arc. Like that is beautiful stuff, and it's still a spoiler ahead that is a piece that Atticus might not have put together if he hadn't had that vision that we saw in the first opening minutes of episode 1.
Right. Right. Another thing that early reviews, I've not done a ton of listening reviews, but like you, I kind of poke around a couple spaces, not mythos spaces, but other spaces. And something that no one seems to be touching on, which is again deeply weird to me, is it's not very often you have a protagonist whose primary main drive is he's a deeply weird book nerd. I mean, yes, he's a soldier, he's physically fit, he's attractive, blah, blah, blah. But at least this episode, a lot of his contributions to the plot, the moments where he shines, moments where he helps solves problems, comes from the fact that he's an obsessive book nerd. And not even like super secret occult text, just like, oh yeah, I read this Lovecraft story and I'm or let me talk about Princess of Mars for 5 fucking minutes. And it's
But
amazing.
that is the most mythos
Yes,
protagonist that you can have. Like that is spot
absolutely.
on.
That's 1,000. Again, that's why I find this argument so stupid because it's like this is almost I won't say the boilerplate mythos investigator, but it is a good way to take that template and do something interesting with it that I just don't see very often, and no one seems to be remarking on that. It's like, no, he's a giant nerd. He's an intellectual hero.
And I like how it's just sort of offhandedly put. The trauma that he endured is the reason he went to become a soldier, and during soldier is where he got to buff up. And
Yep.
everyone commenting on it throughout the first episode
Yes.
to show you that even when he left, he was like a scrawny little nobody and came back buff. And as someone that when I joined the army, I came back. So I joined a little later, and I was a bigger person, and I went to the army, and I came back 120 pounds later. I was like
Wow.
120 pounds soaking wet, Chris. None of my clothes fit. No one recognized me.
Yeah, I can believe that.
And then I choose to spend the next decade or two putting all that weight back on. It is a journey, and one that was fun. And maybe I'll start the journey and lose again. I don't know. Maybe not.
Never know. Never know.
And anything else on this before I get to the bus? Because I want to touch on the bus
No,
scene
yeah, go
too.
for the bus. Yeah.
It was a nice scene to see Atticus and the older woman on the back of the bus with the sign, because that is how it was in the 50s.
Mm.
And the imagery that invokes of having it be an old, I'm not saying older black woman, but a black woman of a certain age, would anyone that's related to history would almost automatically think of Rosa Parks,
Right.
who was not the first black woman to sit on a bus. In fact, it was actually a younger woman who I want to say had kids at the time, and the movement that was going to have Rosa Parks sit there didn't think she was the best person to do it. history.
Tr-
Read up on it, folks.
Yeah,
And so to then have the entire bus scene that breaks down and then walking together. But when Atticus is telling her about the heroes in his books, her taking a specific note about the Confederate soldier, and this is almost a quote. One of the quotes I chose is that you can't put an X in front of that.
yeah. Hmm.
It's so powerful, so pertinent, and descriptive of everything, like hands down. And for all those people that said, well, eventually Lovecraft would turn his views around, you still don't get to put an X in front of it. Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't work like that.
And I love that conversation because, to be honest, I won't say it's like conversations that we have because our conversations are nowhere near as exciting as those. But it's more
Well, maybe if
conversations
we
that should be
wrote them
happening.
ourselves, though.
That's
Maybe if
true.
we wrote them before and then we read them back to each other.
Read the script, script all of our episodes. But I mean, more of those conversations should be happening in fandom, right? It's the because it was an interesting, nuanced conversations. Both sides had valid points in this. It's the one side is you're absolutely right. You can't invalidate the inherent problematic elements of the Burroughs books. They exist. They continue to exist, and you can't just gloss over them. But Atticus also brings the kind of point of like that doesn't invalidate the joy I get from this.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality, like all of these conversations, is somewhere in the middle. The art is diminished but not extinguished by the existence of these things. And it's like the fact they're having it was a nice meta moment because it's they're talking about Princess Amara's, but it's also like, okay, no, we're also talking about Lovecraft here. And while I recognize that's what the conversation's happening, I don't think that Lovecraft gets that pass. But I know that's what the show is trying to do here. It's they're trying to acknowledge the legacy and trying to at least delve into it on some level, which we had mentioned in Watchmen. Sometimes they kind of glossed over a couple of those points. So I recognize they tried to actually do a stand-in to have that conversation.
And I think I want to say that part of it, this goes to show the difference in having a showrunner who's that's their lived experience to someone that has read up on it.
Yeah.
Because in Watchmen, it wasn't front loaded. Watchmen,
Mm.
it came way late in it to like sort
Yeah.
of address it. This is an acknowledgement of it at the top to let you know that we understand that. And now we're going to tell you a story. It's not that here's our story. Oh, yeah, we should probably mention this to you. There's a shifting of importance.
Right. Similarly, you mentioned the sign in the bus. That is something that this whole episode does, and the whole show, but it's really an episode is relentless. Like every time these characters are on the screen somewhere in public, there's always a sign in the background, or a white person staring at them, or there's something going on. It's relentless and very intentionally so. As a white viewer, I became uncomfortable with it, and I realized that was the point. I was supposed to. I was supposed to be uncomfortable with that. So again, like with Watchmen, it built up to that premise. This one's like, no, here's the premise. Here it fucking is. You're not gonna look away from this.
And I know some of the reviews I'm talking about all kinds of things because I have many thoughts are all jumbled in my
Right.
head this morning. Some of the reviews I read saying that is unrealistic. It wouldn't have been that bad. It would have been worse. It is
Yes.
that bad now. I can tell you when I walk down the street, when I walk through my neighborhood walking my dog, I have neighbors that do that.
Mm-hmm.
I have like delivery dudes are coming through the neighborhood, stop to stare at me in my neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
Or cars will park at the top of a hill if they see me and wait for me to walk by to make sure I'm not going towards their house
Mm-hmm.
in my neighborhood. I want to reinforce this just in my neighborhood where I live and exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, yes, it is that bad and worse.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of this, for me, the reason that I guess I glommed onto the show is I can wholeheartedly say that I 90% identify with Tick. Like,
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
what? A big reading black geek that joined the military?
I wonder. I
Maybe.
wonder.
Maybe. All right. And then to get the fact that when the bus breaks down, they actually have to do the walk that we're discussing.
Mm-hmm.
I almost chose Tick's line that saying books are like people, but that doesn't describe the show enough, and that's why I chose the one I did that actually encapsulates the show best
Mm-hmm.
for our opening quote. But then we get to Uncle George, who is in fact my favorite character on this whole show,
Yes,
hands down.
George is great. And I mean, again, it is frustrating that I have to spell this out as a cool moment. But to see two black men in a bookstore being excited about books is so fucking rare to see on the screen, and I was really into that.
I want to point out you have a show that him walking to a neighborhood, a black neighborhood, and the joy of it is also highlighted.
Mm-hmm.
Like the show itself delves deep into trauma too much, over the top amount of trauma.
Right.
But you get these glimpses of what like black joy is. And there should have, if there had been an equal portioning of those, I think it would have benefited the show and they would not have lost as much of their audience that they lost.
Right.
Because you can't, we've already talked on it every so often that you can't oversaturize in one certain area.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And to get Tick walking through the neighborhood, so you get to go to the bar, you get the encounter out back in the bar, so it's like starts touching on all the different aspects of the neighborhood and some of the dynamics. You get people trying to see who Tick is and figuring things out. All very nice, and it gave me a warm fuzzy because I've walked through many a neighborhood like that in my youth, and it's nice and it's beautifully shot. Like there was money spent on the show, is what I want to say, and that is so rare on a black-led show to happen. That's why I can't harp enough that the good outweighs the bad.
Yeah.
There's a lot of high intention and aspiration that unfortunately was not met, but they had the will, the luck, and the talent to try to do it.
And I mean, it showed that HBO was willing to had a strong belief in the show, right? I mean, we talked about this a little bit in the Watchmen show too. Is like this is not inconsiderable amount of money on a network that has built a brand of putting together quality visual and written television drama, particularly. And the fact that these two seasons exist is only made more frustrating with the fact that only two seasons exist, one of each show. But it showed that for a couple of years, HBO was really heavily investing in this portfolio.
And we have the scene that you already talked about, the Artem and Arkham bit. So we're going to transition to the night scene where we meet George. We meet the rest of the family, and we have like the party going at night. And we have Ruby on stage singing. That is a shout out to, I forgot her name. But there is a famous black rock, I want to say she was also a Christian singer from the 50s who had the same sort of body shape and booming voice that Ruby had. That was fucking fantastic. If I remember her name, we'll drop it in the schnotes.
And I mean, that's another thing I actually liked is we don't Ruby, to be perfectly blunt, she was sexy, right? She was presented as a sex symbol, and it was completely believable. And you don't see very many women, not only dark skinned black women, but just women of that kind of size presented in that capacity, and it was completely believable, and I love that.
But then they swiftly undercut it with the introduction of Letty.
Yes.
Like, let's yank that carpet from under you right now.
Yeah. And it's funny because the scene is framed where like Ruby and Letty are fighting, right? And they're not happy together. And Letty's kind of being snarky about. I'm sorry, Ruby's being snarky about Letty coming in to sing with her and whatnot. And the show is trying to tell me we should be sympathetic to Letty, and I wasn't. I was like, no, Ruby's absolutely right. You kind of came on stage and stole her thunder for doing her thing, and she should be mad at you. And yeah, you're lucky you're getting 2 days sleeping on her couch.
And you came to do it because you want money. You didn't come back just to see me. You came because you wanted something, which is very much a family dynamic. I guess to that point, I'll digress a little bit and say that as an old fogey now, when I watch the musical Rent, I am no longer sympathetic with the squatters. I am sympathetic with their friend. Let me repeat that, who used to be one of them, but realized I needed money got a
Yep.
job and has let them squat there for 2 years, and now needs like them to woohoo, 2 years of squatting, and he is their antagonist now. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
all right. But so we get the introduction, and Letty gets to see who Tick is. Tick sees Letty, and we get that chemistry, that vibe we're going to get. That these will be our primary two characters, because there's going to be a
Hmm.
romance that happens. Next morning, we have the three of them. Letty sort of pops up, so we know that she's going to become part of the road trip now.
Yep.
Because she's going to be dropped off, and they like head out together.
Hmm.
We get a little bit of fun, sort of traveling. Oh, sorry, I forgot. Dee gives the comic book to her dad,
Oh yeah, yeah,
because
yeah.
she used to draw comics of all of his trips, but this time it features basically her mother character and not her dad anymore. And there was tension between George and Hypatia about her being able to do the trips too, so he doesn't have to do them. So we create that dynamic, and him making a promise saying, "Don't worry, next time maybe we can go together."
Hmm.
So, which you know right there, just from writing, George is going to die.
Right. Yeah. We've established your family in a very short order, and everything is happy, and there's no tension in your family. Someone's dying soon.
Yeah. And we get them sort of traveling along. They encounter some racism when they actually stop at a place. This is one of the things that I love, is when they went to that restaurant and like the walls are all white and they sort of split up, and the gradual realization of what's going on. Like, George is engaged, and I think the map or the book trying to figure it out. Tick is looking around, and Letty is in the back, unbeknowingly investigating.
Mm-hmm.
And Tick asking George questions, and George has answers like this. Like, Tick knows something is up, but George has the knowledge, but he's not paying attention. So it shows you a well-built, for role-playing terms, party. Like, that's a great party that they've built right there.
Mm-hmm.
I would go on Mythos investigations with them.
Absolutely. And it was, I actually, in my personal notes, I had written down the Chris Spivey moment of a man realizing a historical fact to solve a problem. Why is the White House painted white again? I was just like, oh my God.
All right, you know me too well. No more podcasts. Take a break.
Done.
And so we get the car chase, which out of town, which is nice. But the pinnacle of that is when they encounter the racist sheriff. And you get to see that dynamic. Have been pulled over multiple times by the police. And there's a level of fear and anxiety as a black person when you're stopped by the police. Like, hands down. Like, you don't know if you're going to be driving away from the situation. Either being incarcerated, if you're lucky, or being buried later.
Mm-hmm.
And so that fear displayed there was more intense than like the monster scene that we'll get later for me as a viewer.
I completely believe that.
And so I guess a random tidbit about me, since we're sharing on the Lovecraft podcast, is that when we drive a lot of places as a family, I frequently let my wife drive and I will not drive.
Mm-hmm.
So we are harassed less.
It's awful that you have to be tactical about it, but I also completely understand it.
There you go, folks. Real world information early in the morning. Well, actually, it's late morning this morning. Woo.
But yeah, like I one thing you jumped ahead, but the one of the small bits that scene that, like, first of all, I really love the fact that the slowest car chase scene in the world was made intensely suspenseful, and that actual people doing actual car chases could learn something from how that scene was shot and staged. Because they're literally going 25 miles an hour, and it was super suspenseful. But the other one is, I loved Tick's moment of him starting to get back in the car and stops, goes, "Is it legal to make a U-turn here?" It was on the surface, it was a casual conversation, but it was him going, "Wait, there's a trap here," and again catching it before the trap was sprung.
Yep.
Really reinforcing just how smart Tick is.
And then you get that same white racist energy that realizes they've been outsmart, but they still have some sort of power in that situation, and they will still do something to diminish or dehumanize you.
Yep.
And you get to see Letty's face as she watches what Tick has to do, which in of itself is almost a telling moment It is a telling moment since we watch more of the show and we know the colorism involved in it, which gives you an idea that possibly Letty has never had to do that.
Mm, true.
So, like, there are all these things spread throughout, which is why I was expecting a larger conversation somewhere about colorism in the show that
Mm,
never happens.
mm.
And they make the turn, and it is the slowest of slow drives, and it is so intense.
I know.
And when you think about it, they're literally racing the sun. Like, that
Yeah.
is your.
Yeah.
How could that be suspenseful? But it is.
It's so good.
Like the acting, the cinematography, it is all exceptional. And you get more of the racism when he knows that he can't get them since he made a promise. So instead, he starts trying to like hit the back of their car to disrupt them. Like
Mm-hmm.
it goes back again to reinforce that you cannot trust Whitey. No offense, Eddie.
Nope, not taken. White people suck.
And they escape the racist sheriff, or so they believe,
Right.
who has already called in to the rest of his team to have them waiting for them to show up to show you that even if you win, you still lose.
Mm-hmm.
Like that is how it works.
Right. But again, like this goes back to I'm just obsessed about people saying there's not Lovecraft in this. But like that's a Lovecraftian story, right? That is a mythos story right there. It's like no matter how smart you are, no matter how well you planned are, you still lose. It's just that it doesn't involve a bug-eyed monster. That's the only difference. But otherwise, structurally, it is a mythos story. Something that has more power over you ultimately will win no matter what you do. That's the mythos.
Yes. Which is one of the reasons why. So for me, I first encountered, I'm going to digress a little bit. I first encountered Lovecraft in an estate sale. I may have mentioned this in the podcast. I don't know if I mentioned it here or Onyx Path podcast that you interviewed me on. So in case folks didn't know, the reason this podcast exists is that Eddy has interviewed me, I want to say 3 times for Onyx Path.
Yeah.
And I think the last time was just us, and we got along really well. And I suggested, hey, let's do a podcast together.
And I
And
said,
Eddy thought I
no,
was
that would be
joking.
a terrible idea. We certainly won't do that. And we certainly should never do superheroes for 39 weeks.
He thought I was joking, which of course he didn't realize I don't joke about that. I put it out as a joke to catch you off guard, and then I got you. And here we are, like 2 years later, happily still stuck together to some extent. Distance doesn't matter. It's a spiritual connection that binds us together. Over. No, should I not do this bit?
No, it's the friends we made along the way, right? Exactly.
Damn it! If you're gonna make it a quick, easy joke, it's not to say it.
Low effort.
So I first encountered Lovecraft in an estate sale when I was around 13. An estate sale is when someone passes away. They need to send in someone to like box up all their stuff and watch it till the movers come the next morning. And in Alabama, they don't want to pay a lot of money, so they get a group of kids, 8 of us that are about 13, to sit in this dead person's house all night with our sleeping bags around like a little flashlight together. And they said, anything you want in the house, you can take, and it's yours as long as it's not bigger than like a TV. So very narrowed guidelines. And I found a bunch of books, and I took, God, what was it? 30 books, because each individual book is not bigger than a TV. And if you don't specify, Chris will get you.
That is correct. Yeah, technically correct.
And one of the books I found was like a complete works of H.P. Lovecraft. And I didn't know who he was at the time. And I sat there and I was in my sleeping bag with my flashlight, and I was reading some different stories. And the one that stuck out to me most was like The Outsider. Mm-hmm. But that overwhelming feeling that no matter what you did, no matter how smart you are, you can't win or succeed, resonated with me as a 13-year-old living in Alabama who was, some people would say, overly smart, definitely overly talkative. And that is one of the reasons why I have such a complex relationship with Lovecraft. Like the core idea behind it resonates with me, if not the prose themselves.
Right.
Chris's digression corner. We can jump ahead if you want. Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, honestly, like you said before, the Shoggoth fight is kind of the least interesting part of the episode in a lot of ways.
Yeah. But this is for people that care a little bit about the mythos. A Shoggoth, at least in Lovecraftian text, is this big, massive, like gelatinous cube with like a bajillion eyes. It rolls around and does stuff. For this, they've changed that to almost werewolves. If anyone here is familiar
Yeah.
with Excalibur comics, in their look, but they function almost like furless vampiric werewolves
Okay.
because they're nocturnal, because they fear the
Right.
light, but they're big like werewolves,
Hmm.
and when they bite you, you eventually turn into one of them.
But again, like the you said the argument was that they weren't Shoggoths and people were mad about that. But Tick in the episode described Shoggoths the way you did, so Tick knows what Shoggoths are from the original material, which means the writers knew, and this is an intentional change.
Yeah,
So to imply that they got it wrong is just there's no evidence on the screen that that's true.
but then that goes easily into the fact that like Lovecraft himself was a person that existed in this world, which is why they're able to read Lovecraft books. So
Right.
it goes to the fact that maybe his information he has is shoddy,
Right.
and this is what it really is, which is a
Right.
nice layered touch.
Hmm. Similar to how nearly all of the Sherlock Holmes stories were written by Watson, and therefore Watson, as a fallible person, could possibly have gotten things wrong. And there we have lots of gaps to inject things into the Holmes canon.
Yep. And then it allows the characters to have to make logical conclusions about things that they see and piece things together. Like when they're in the cabin, Uncle George referenced it as a vampire since that guy seems to be changing. Like a very
Mm,
nice touch. And how we get the fact that they are vulnerable or scared of light. How
mm.
vampire mythology vampires are. I will point out that there's attack, but we get to see Letty's superpower. You're about to see it right now. And do you know
Which
what
is
that superpower is?
what is it, super Chris?
Letty fucking Lewis could outrun Jesse Owens. Did you see that stride? Like fuck, like that is the best superpower to have in a horror game, hands down.
I mean, I will say she is a woman in a horror story, so they always get bonuses to their speed. So
And she is in appropriate shoes for it, regardless of everything else. Beautiful, beautiful. Mm.
yes.
Um, then we get like her crashing back in. The sheriff transforms to a monster. They get killed by Tick. Then they stumble into the mansion where they meet William that morning. The scene
Mm.
of them stumbling up to the mansion, that instant contrast in the day compared to the horror they experienced at night, beautiful. I love the stark shift that presented.
Yeah. Um, I have a comment, but it's kind of an awkward place. I'll talk about it here, but it does. I have to talk about episode 2 very very briefly. One of the things that I loved when I watched this show is that it is both a modern drama slash horror show and also an evolution of both the Monster of the Week stuff we've been watching the past couple of weeks and also the pulp novels themselves. Because like each episode, there is kind of a self-contained plot, to the point where you can watch these episodes in isolations and still kind of get the whole plot. You don't necessarily have to follow all of the threads through, although there are very strong threads through. Don't get me wrong; it's still a serialized show, um, but it also felt like an anthology of short stories that happen to have similar characters linking them together. So structurally, it felt like it's coming from the tradition of something like Supernatural, just as much as something like Watchmen, which was very much what we talked about the long movies, right? So it was really interesting to me to see that this is kind of structured a bit like older television. Because this is the episode where we run into the Shoggoths, and next episode is the episode we run into, the next monster, which I won't go into yet. So I mean, it was really a neat evolution of an older form while still keeping the HBO style, heavily serialized structure that they're known for in 2020. Um, it was a little structural thing, and again, I personally think it's probably a nod more towards the pulp novels themselves because pulp novels were very short, generally speaking.
Yeah.
And a lot of them were short stories that were published in various different magazines, wherever they can get work from, then probably compiled later by a very small press. So it had that vibe of this was a writer probably around 1925 who wrote these stories, and just kept using the same character because it was easy to dash out a story in a weekend with the same character and try to sell it to a magazine, and then put them together into a book. It was a neat little structural touch that I really liked, and I felt like it made the show stronger because you could watch an episode and get like this episode has a beginning, middle, and an end. It has a cliffhanger, which is again very serialized, but it's also almost in the literal serial tradition. But on top of all of that, it's so distinctly the show that the cliffhanger is, oh shit, it's a white guy, right? Like that is a genuine moment of terror for these characters. But that is a real cliffhanger for this show. So it's a lot of layers this is working on just from a structural standpoint that I really really appreciate. And I'm like, I don't know if how much thought went into this. I am inclined to think that this is all intentional, given the caliber of the people we're talking about that worked on it.
Yes.
But that means that this show is working on okay, um, cosmic horror show, a horror show about being black in the 20th century, or in general, a monster of the week show, a serialized show, an homage to pulp novels, and there's like so many things that are happening all at once to the point where maybe that's why it felt a bit heavy on the trauma because it had so many things going on that it wasn't room to let the characters just breathe. It was maybe a little too structured, but I was just really appreciative of the fact that this was, like I said, a nod towards older television structures.
I think what it is that they got a copy of Harlem Unbound and they read it and they were like, man, this guy Chris Spivey is a genius. But it's
Yes,
a
we're
role
not gonna pay
playing
him.
book, so we're not going to contact him. But
Right, we're not
let's
gonna pay him
take
any
some of
money.
his
God
greatness.
no.
That is my now internal headcanon. Any other comments about episode 1?
No, let's move on.
Season 1, episode 2, Whitey on the Moon. All right, let me do my my spoken word one more time. William explains that the mansion is Artem's lodge. What? Strike that. Let's redo that. William explains that the mansion is Arden's lodge, designed by Titus Braithwaite, a enslaved trader and founder of the occult secret society called the Sons of Adam. George realizes that Atticus is a descendant through implied sexual assault of Titus and thus a premier member of the Sons. Because of this powerful heritage, Samuel, the current owner of the lodge and leader of the Sons, plans to use and potentially sacrifice Atticus in an upcoming ritual. The white woman who played such a large role earlier was revealed to be Samuel's daughter, Christina, who has a whistle that controls the Shoggoths. After telling Atticus that not all white people are bad, she traps the travelers in their respective rooms with a magical force field. They eventually break out and rescue Montrose, Atticus' father, who George had earlier deduced was being held captive in a nearby village. Samuel stops him, shooting and killing Letty and seriously wounding George. Atticus agrees to cooperate in the ritual to save their lives, but the magic backfires as a black former enslaved woman in a 19th century dress appears, implied to be Atticus's ancestor, to aid them, turning Samuel and the other sons to stone and burning down the mansion. Atticus escapes the fire in a long run, only to discover that Letty has been resurrected and George has succumbed to his wounds.
Right. Uh, I wanted to start with something insightful, but the first thing I want to think of is I just love moving on up as the opening song to this episode. As a man of a certain age.
I second that. And the scene that each of them getting to enjoy the thing they love,
Yes.
and to see George and just the books and like smelling them, taking them out, putting them to the side,
Mhm.
like Letty trying all the different clothes. It is a joyous moment that you know will soon be shattered.
Right. And again, it's you see two of the main characters because let's be honest, they're being seduced, right? They're being seduced by the comforts of the house, and Atticus is like immediately going, "No, this is a trap." Um, and the show does a good job at this stage of they did a little bit in episode 1, but in episode 2, of all of the characters think Atticus is just a little too paranoid, a little too suspicious. And so there's always kind of slow pushback of like, oh, you should just enjoy it. But Atticus is always right. And that's an interesting through line through this early part of the show of Atticus just continually proven that his suspicions are usually correct. It reinforces his intelligence. It's a nice balance of, yes, I book smart, but also I went through a very complicated and messy war. So we as the viewer could go, it could be PTSD, it could be shell shock, but it's not, and it never is.
And he survived his father, which we
Yeah,
get to understand more. But that is even sprinkled throughout all these episodes that it was not a loving relationship.
right, right. But the other thing I really love is this is the thing I was trying to struggling about timing wise. This very much feels like the pulp writer going, we need a reason for Atticus to be part of the Sons of Adam, so let's give him this sudden revelation of his family history. But it's not an arbitrary plot device. It builds on other stuff, and then it's structured very well. It's like it seems like an out of nowhere reveal, but it actually goes somewhere else. So that's a really cool and interesting touch, and it ends up leading towards a new conversation and a new way of exploring things, but also is very much the crap. I need a reason to get my protagonist into this plot this week on my serial. What do I do? So it's perfect because it works well, but it still keeps that flavor.
I'll also point out that it plays perfectly with history and how the
Mm-hmm.
founding fathers weren't enslavers, who did force themselves on black people and
Yep.
who had children with them and then still enslaved their children,
Mm-hmm.
who may or may not had slightly better privilege but were still enslaved, like Ben Franklin, and an array of other people. So
Mm-hmm.
when you think about your founding fathers, remember they're all mostly, let me rephrase that, enslavers. And they may have said that they would free their enslaved people upon my death.
Right.
I
And
may
again,
live
this
another
show,
40 years.
right. But again, this show did what Watchmen kind of. No, not Watchmen. We had a similar scene in Sleepy Hollow that kind of lightly addressed this, and this show more directly tackles that.
Mm-hmm.
Of the direct thing of kind to his slaves does not mean what that code thinks it means.
And we get the great scene of all of them dancing, and then they get called out for breakfast with a bell, if I remember properly,
Yeah.
which in of itself is kind of insulting because if you think about it, bells were frequently used to call servants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the quarters they are in, while they look luxurious, I think might have been servants' quarters too, based on how large the mansion was. That is speculation on my part. I have to rewatch that last part, but the bell calling definitely is reminiscent of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And that's
and only Atticus is the one who questions that. Everybody else is like, "Oh, okay, it's time for the meal," and Atticus is like, "What was that?" And it gets explained to him, and he doesn't seem satisfied with the explanation.
and then even when they sit down for breakfast, they Atticus questions all of them, and they don't remember what happened last night, which gets him to put together that something has happened to his friends, as he keeps
Mm-hmm.
trying to explain it to them. And as they're having a very intense conversation between Atticus and George to the side, you have Letty, who uses the bell to call the servant. So if you missed it up there,
Yeah,
we're going to put it right here and make it obvious for you what we just said.
right.
And then the two of them look shocked as she just sort of looks back at them saying, "What? I'm calling for a servant." Which goes back again to the colorism piece where the two of them would not have thought to have done that because that is not the experience they would have had compared to potential experiences that Letty would have had.
Mm-hmm.
Like constantly reinforcing the colorism, but they're not saying it or discussing it. So that makes it incredibly problematic.
Right. Particularly because the show is very clearly happy to talk about other aspects of it. So this is a place where the omission is particularly jarring. Now that you bring it up, I can totally see that.
And this is by the middle of the second episode. Like, I'm sorry,
Mm-hmm.
not even the middle, the first fourth of the second episode.
Mm-hmm.
And they eventually get Atticus takes them in the car. They see that Woody's been repaired; it's not damaged, and they go to the village. Oh, I love the village of cultists. I'm sorry, the village of just innocent people living their daily lives.
I mean, was I the only one getting kind of pseudo prisoner vibes off of that whole thing?
I was thinking Wicker Man,
Oh, that's even better. Folk horror. Yeah, that's actually a much better analogy.
just like hands down. And then when we get the not the sheriff, but the game warden, we'll call her, with a
Yeah.
nod to Watchmen, that sort of runs him off, and you get George deducing what's going on, like the stone tower and everything else. Realize there's probably a prison or something underneath it. Like beautiful investigative skills.
Mhm.
Love it. And if you didn't know before George was going to die, this is when you would definitely know that George is too much of an investigator to be alive for the next 8 episodes.
Right. Yeah, you're too useful. You got to go, buddy.
And we get our chase in the woods. But what I do like, I'm going to fast forward us to the part where Atticus demands that they lift the spell from George and Letty,
Mhm.
which is a great moment because they instantly start screaming from the horrors they saw, which then makes you question whether or not Christina was being benevolent to try to erase that memories from them,
Right.
and whether or not it was better that they know the actual truth.
Mhm. Yeah, and there's an interesting tightrope happening here because uh, in terms of the dialogue, there's a lot of very neutral conversations here, and you could be confused as to maybe what's going on. But the cinematography and the acting, there is no ambiguity. These people are the villains of the piece, right? Christina is not someone who wants to help you. Everything, all the iconography points towards these people want to hurt them. So it's an interesting tight walk because there's no suspense from the audience perspective, but we have to. The characters need to have a reasonable doubt to make them not seem stupid. Um, and so it's I'm still kind of in awe that how they managed to pull that off because that is so difficult to do because usually you need to either lean into an aside or an image that only the audience can see and say nope they're obviously evil so we know or you end up having characters acting like idiots just to kind of get the plot moving along but every step is extremely plausible in how this comes across where the character's like, I'm unsure of their motivations. Like when we do, I'm just going, no, 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 no. There's no debate. What are you doing? Get out of there, right?
I'm going to jump directly to the dinner. Is there anything you want to discuss before the
No.
dinner?
Oh, I mean, the only other thing I was going to mention is uh, uh, there are little moments of humor that are just pure genre humor that I really love. Like the when the force fields go up, when Atticus bounces off the force field, that is straight up Star Trek bullshit, right? It's the physical acting of I have to hit an invisible wall that I know is not there and bounce off it to sell that there's an invisible wall there. I'm like, that is 60s sci-fi acting. And it was so obviously just the little moments of like I thought that was hilarious, but nothing about the scene was funny. Same like with the Artem moment. There's actually tiny little bits of humor that I wish there were more of because I think it would have helped leaven the whole show because the show was clearly trying to have fun with this on some level by playing with the no we are really huge fans of these genres and we want to really showcase our love of them whereas I think when we watched Watchmen gave itself the room to go no we're occasionally going to do some really genuinely funny or appreciative moments because we love these comics and I think the show didn't give itself enough room to do that so when you see those little moments it's almost like I wish I had seen a little more of that.
Oh, agreed. And
But
at
yes,
the
the dinner.
dinner, we have Letty doesn't get to go to dinner because not only are they racist, they're also sexist at the time, which a lot of from reading the clubs were gentlemen's clubs and
Yep.
there were no ladies allowed.
Mm-hmm.
And we have both of them dressed to the nines to go in to disrupt the entire white dinner, just showing up and everyone staring at them. And to then have George break down what their rules say that they have to adhere to in a book that he found, which we know is placed by Christina for him to find.
Right.
So you can see that Christina has a larger plan that she's working on.
Mm-hmm.
And to see Tick give an order that people, if they believe what they say they do, have to obey. And there's that struggle to like, I don't want to take this order from this black man. I am a white person of power and privilege. Why do I have to do this? And it just takes one of them to break for all the rest of them to do the same.
Going back to your comment about this being a perfect party, it was straight up George just rolling persuade checks, and then Atticus following up with the intimidation check. Because you see George is quoting chapter and verse of the rules, and then Atticus going, "So that means get the fuck out." And I was like, "That is so perfect."
It works on everyone except Samuel, who you find doesn't believe in the beliefs. He's just using it as a tool,
Mhm.
which goes back to showing layers of power and structure inside of each other. And usually the people at the top don't really care about the people that are working for them and are just using them and putting on a show. Like that is a nice layered showing of how things work when you peel away the other pieces of it.
Yep. Yeah.
We get them freeing Montrose, who Montrose actually freed himself. You find out.
Right.
So convenient TV timing is I will give that one to them. Given they even said his favorite book was like The Count of Monte Cristo,
Yes.
and him being upset with him for coming and saying that he didn't write the letter to Tick, which goes back and makes sense because in the first episode they're like, this handwriting doesn't seem like Montrose's style.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
So again, showing thought, remembering they did that, and then following up on it. Like these are little touches that I, as a writer, love and frequently look for and nitpick. So I'm giving them all the kudos for these things.
Hmm. Absolutely. And even like in the first episode, they also, at one point in time, George had a copy of a different Dumas book, and so like them mentioning Dumas again is like, okay, even things that don't necessarily need to be reinforced, they still do. There's attention to detail that I really really liked.
We get the great escape attempt where they're filling each other in on everything, and we get another fucking force field. And I love these force fields. I love them so much that I squeed when I saw it the first time. I was like, yes.
Yes. And they spent
And
money.
then we get
They spent like good money on the CGI of those force fields.
it's important to sell those force fields, otherwise. And we get the scene where we have George and Montrose having a talk that Tick may not be Montrose's son, which is an interesting thing.
Mm,
And they're talking about their own dynamic. And you can tell how intense it is because even while George is lying on the bed dying, they're having a fight about that.
yeah, yeah. There's one of the things that I think really helps this show tensely is that everyone has very human relationships. There's maybe Letty a little bit, but most everyone has strong character motivations for what they're doing. So like, even though it's a heavily plot driven show, it doesn't feel like it. It feels like everything comes naturally from the character motivations, even though structurally they're very clearly falling into, like I said earlier, different monster of the week plots effectively. So it feels very natural, and of course the actors are absolutely doing their damnedest to sell that and doing a wonderful job. But it feels like a very real conversation in this, when you take a step back and think about it, completely batshit situation.
I'm going to jump ahead. And we have the ritual that goes wrong because of the intervention of Tick's ancestor.
Mhm.
And it was a good special effect. And then we
Yeah.
get the realization when Tick escapes that George is dead.
Hmm. And Letty has been resurrected,
Yep.
and it's
Literally, Jesus back into existence, you'd say.
yeah, yeah, and it's just like again, one of the things I love about the weird pulp era is, I've used the word before, confidence. It just boldface presents stuff and said, "This is just what's going on." And it's like, yeah, this is the episode where we're dealing with magic, we're dealing with evil magicians, and so you're going to see a lot of evil, weird magic shit. And so of course we're going to have a character come back from the dead because that's what you do in these kinds of episodes. But what's interesting, and we'll talk about this more in the next episode again because there's some weird structural stuff happening here, is that the one thing this show does differently is it keeps the consequences of each of these genres it's chopping through. So the fact that she's coming back to life, that's a consequence that sticks and goes on. And so other episodes have to live with the decisions of the previous episodes, which again feels very pulp writer trying to crank things out and going, oh wait, no, I did this in the Shadow novel 14, so on this one I have to do this other. I have to remember that. It's little touches of people who just really clearly love genre TV.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to the last episode for this one. Season 1, Episode 9, Rewind, 1921. Hypatia returns to Chicago to find Atticus, Letty, and Montrose struggling to keep Dee alive after her being cursed. Ruby summons Christina, who uses Hypatia's blood to reset the curse, but warns him that because Lancaster was the only one who knew the curse, it can't be fully lifted. Christina then visits and taunts a dying Lancaster and convinces Ruby to aid her in her quest for immortality, even after revealing that the spell will kill Tick. The others use the multiverse machine, traveling back in time to 1921 Tulsa, where Tick's family held the Book of Names before it was destroyed in the Tulsa Race Massacre. Upon arriving in 1921, Tick, Letty, and Montrose witness a young Montrose being beaten by his father. The adult Montrose flees. Tick goes looking for Montrose and finds him watching his younger self rebuke a potential love interest, Thomas, due to his struggling with internalized homophobia and the external oppression of the time. Before the pair of them, as well as a young George and Dora, are set upon by a white mob who succeed in killing Thomas. Tick comes to everyone's rescue. Letty is saved from attackers by Tick's family, even though she was shot and she's still invulnerable, and goes in the house, who hid in their house as it is attacked by another mob. Letty convinces Tick's great-grandmother to hand over the Book of Names by promising to safeguard her family and their legacy. And Letty slow walks through the bombing and fire and death of untold black people towards the portal, and all of them return to 1955.
And so now we're in episode 9. The show goes, okay, so now we're going to do Stargate. Stargate
Stargate was a
slash
good show.
Quantum Leap. Yeah. And it just does it. It just, there's a multiverse machine. Okay. Yeah.
So before we get into it, figuring out the third episode for this run was probably one of the hardest things I have had to do for the show.
Mm-hmm.
I debated between episode 6, but that character doesn't really show up in the other pieces enough, so I didn't do that one.
Mm-hmm.
Episode 7, which was Hypatia's journey to get all the stuff that she has, or
Right.
this one. But I chose this one for a specific reason in the end, because it highlights the relationship between Tick and Montrose, and George and Montrose's own internal struggles.
Right. And it, again, I mean, this is when genre TV is at its most powerful, frankly. It's the, let's use the trappings of this utterly ludicrous concept to tell a completely human story. And it's, I mean, we talked a lot about the time travel episode we covered in Watchmen, right? And I at least really heavily praised the structure and how they use the structure to tell an emotional story about a woman having an entire romantic relationship in the course of a dinner. And this is a different version of that same trick, done equally well. Of let's talk about let's take this ludicrous concept and all of this aggregate stuff we've built up over 8 episodes, and in the process of that, make Montrose an utterly sympathetic character when we've had no reason to like him for most of the show.
This is a flashback episode done right.
Yeah. Yes, and there's no island. There's no.
Because it is literally telling their history. It is a flashback to when they were. Time travel used, but still, to give us all that. But it's also a nice touch that it reinforces how I mentioned at the start of the show, that it adds in Tick's vision to what happened with the baseball bat, him saying a very specific line that Jackie Robinson said to him. So that is very cyclical and nice. And it also shows a strong connection to family, how important family is, be it a blood family or, in a sense, like a found family
Hmm.
because
Yeah.
Montrose and George and Dora became a found family based on the massacre they went to. And
Hmm.
that felt like a sort of relationship that couldn't be broken regardless of everything else around them.
Hmm. It, I mean, I don't have much else to say about that. I kind of want to pivot briefly.
Yeah, we're a
Uh,
pivoting show.
this One of the things I like about this episode in particular and this goes back to my earlier point about Tick being a book nerd and why that's important, is because Hypatia spells out here are the rules of time travel in this show. I mean, just straight out of Doctor Who technobabble of here's how time travel works, right? And it's specifically it's a multiverse. She's been to different Earths, and so she's like a little vague on you're not going back in time. You're going to a parallel Earth. And Atticus is like, no, I've read science fiction. We can't change the past. So Atticus is arguing a different theory of time travel purely based on the stories he's read. And it is a level of self awareness that is just staggering because it's the show going, we're going to present a completely thought out version of time travel and tell you it's okay to change the past because here it's a multiverse and so it's okay. And then Atticus going, no, you can't do that. And then it all ends up being actually the time travel version of everything ultimately clicks together. That's the time travel theory we're going with is that you can't actually change the past. Everything falls into place. But it's not done in the prescriptive way of the doctor going, you can't change the past, not one line. It's rather the protagonist going, I've read too many of these stories, and I know what happens when you step on the butterfly because I read that story. So we don't want to do this. And it's just a great moment of, again, completely character driven time travel nonsense, not completely arbitrary plot driven time travel nonsense.
Oh, I love it. And before, since I skipped ahead the time travel piece, it is another issue that I have that we mentioned at the top of the show is the portrayal of Ruby in Ruby's story arc throughout the entire course of the show.
Hmm.
Like her overwhelming desire to be white, her willingness now to
Yeah.
sacrifice Atticus to help Christina, and all the other problems associated with that. Yeah, I want to make sure that it's something that we mentioned. And also the blatant, like, amazing amount of trauma that they put the character D throughout the course of the show.
Yeah.
And you can say it's for the story, but the way it was done is too over the top, I guess is what I want to say.
Right. I mean, the one of the things that episode 9 showed me, and then when again, this is where I think the format of our show helps me to see this a little clearer because I didn't notice it the first time I watched it. Every single protagonist in this show has been traumatized by this point. All of them. No escapes. I mean, Hippolyta is maybe the only she's been traumatized too, but also she's turned into the doctor, so it's kind of okay. But even then, she's kind of in the Dr. Manhattan school of I am now too far above your petty concerns to be able to engage with you anymore. Um, but everyone is just deeply, deeply traumatized, and uh, and we have this awkward moment of with the Montrose story. Like on the one hand, I really loved it. Like it's like yes, I mean, frankly, there should be more black queer relationships on screen in general. Anyway,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
um, and he the complex relationship that he and George and his wife had, and how that all pans out is all very organic and telling. And yet, at no point, do they also address okay, the reason why he didn't say this was because it was illegal to be homosexual at this time, right? So I mean, it's one piece where it's like one of the few moments where I'm like, actually, I think you actually need one more step of trauma because if you don't know a bit of history, you don't understand why he's so terrified of this. And it's like it's not. Yes, it's because he's black. That's obviously a huge part of it, but also separately, it is illegal. When the I can't even say the line because it's just two slurs in a row. But it's the he's being him and his boyfriends basically are being hunted down both because they're black and because they're gay. And it was perfectly legal to do that to either category. So double is a jackpot from a bigger perspective. But the show
And
doesn't really mention that at all. So that's one place
I
where it's
want
like a
to
little bit of weird stuff. But
I want to take a moment to definitely point out something to for our listeners is that media has a tendency to overly display black people having a stronger prejudice against um, LGBTQI than other groups of people, and that's not true. That is
mhm.
a media projection, and I want to make sure that I state that on our podcast while we're talking
Oh,
about
good
that,
point. Yeah.
and that it is totally a fake lie the media is promoting. And
Mhm.
it happens, but it happens from all the different groups roughly the same amount. But media has a tendency to try to villainize black people.
Right. Yeah. So uh, for me, again, it's like I come from a queer family, so I mean, I'm a little more inclined to the queer presentation at this point. I was really excited to see a complicated, interesting queer relationship that I was just not expecting. Like it didn't come out of nowhere. It's one of those things that you see it and you go, oh, everything in the past 8 episodes falls into place now. This is clearly building to this, and using time travel to explain that is a perfect example using genre tropes to sell that relationship. But for a show that was so good about presenting the historical the horror of the historical components they were going through, it was a weird omission to me because
Mm-hmm.
that was such an easy thing to kind of say we would have died, you know.
And to move us ahead, because I think we're running a little long,
Yeah.
it we get to see the importance of family in like the black community. And if you don't know a lot about history, there were a lot of all black towns because a lot of white people at various points in time says, "Why don't you go form your own communities?"
Hmm.
And there's some black people who said, "You know what? We fucking will go form our own communities." And they went and formed their own communities, and they were incredibly successful. And those same white racists said, "Fuck, we want what you have."
Right.
And so they would come and kill and terrorize and steal from those black people that they already had oppressed and kicked out, that forced them out of their own societies to reintegrate them in.
Hmm.
It is a constantly ongoing struggle of a a, a power dynamic and the power player in that re-oppressing the people that don't have the power to stop it constantly. And it is a perfect representation of the mythos that you cannot win. All you can do is struggle for one more good day.
Hmm. Yeah.
The last thing I want to say about this is going to touch on colorism and Letty watching all these darker skinned people die and burn around her.
Hmm.
Hypatia is dying trying to keep a portal open. And we've seen Letty's superpower is to run. And with her immortality given to her by a white woman, slow walks through a massacre to the portal.
Yeah.
And I mean like slow walks. And I understand it is visually beautiful, but from a storytelling perspective, that tells me everything I need to know.
Right. And again, it's the weird moment of like this spell. She died, she came back, and now because of the magic spell, she has this ability to be immortal functionally. And so the show's trying to again play with the consequences of decisions of earlier stories that it went through. Um, but that one just landed weird to me too, because it was like, if you're immortal, why don't you just hold the portal open? Because then nobody has to die.
She didn't have the conduits that Hypatia had from traveling.
Oh, fair, but still. Um, I don't know. Maybe it was just maybe it's just also the case where the core story of Montrose ends up kind of throwing everything. It's so strong and powerful that maybe everything else feels weaker by consequence, and then maybe what's going on here in my head, because that Montrose story is just. I mean, oh god, just hearing him narrate the story as you're watching the brutality. Ugh, I had to pause while watching that. I'm like, I need a minute because that was just, and the actor just he's not overselling the emotion. He's just very quietly explaining it, which is exactly the right way to kind of pitch that.
He
So
was
when you
one of
get
the
to
greatest
cut,
actors of our time.
yeah, yeah. So when you cut back to Letty just kind of holding someone's hand and watching someone burn to death, it's like, I know what you're trying to go for. You're trying to juxtapose those, but it doesn't feel nearly the same.
And we actually skipped another scene that's really important from Montrose, where he got to go to like a dance
Mm-hmm.
of like other gay men, and that was like a really powerful scene too. It was either a dance or a vision that he had, because I only watched this series once when it first came out, and for this
Mm-hmm.
podcast, because I said that bit about Christina and them paralleling it to Emmett Till
Yeah.
did it for me. I was out like.
Yeah.
But that was like another great scene if you haven't watched the whole thing. It's something that's
Mm-hmm.
worth considering to watch.
Yeah.
Any closing thoughts on Lovecraft Country?
Um, for me, I feel like Lovecraft Country is a great example of why we need to do ambitious television. Because we've talked about it, it's messy in a lot of ways, right? I mean, structurally, it's not messy at all, but it's complicated. It's not. Oh, we love the show unabashedly. There's a lot of caveats we had to put into it, but I think all of that tells me that we need more shows that are willing to risk that kind of stuff. Because to your point, when this hits, it hits so strong on both the obvious analogies, like juxtaposing the Black experience with Lovecraftian horror is just a very good thing. I mean, obviously, you know how well that works. But the show is a really strong image, and the show really tried to deliver that. And so, not being perfect about it, perfect is the enemy of good. And I think this is a show that just tried to be good. And as frustrating as some of the omissions are, and some of the awkwardness of it, and some of the problems with it, I absolutely respect that it is ultimately good.
I'm in a similar boat. I think as I said at the top, and I'll say it again here: the good outweighs the bad.
Mm-hmm.
I would have watched the second season if they got it, but HBO decided not to renew it for a second season,
Mm-hmm.
which I don't know why. That's how I said for Supernatural. I think that Black and marginalized led shows should be able to do what Supernatural did and run for 15 great, mediocre, and bad to good to
Yeah,
good seasons.
absolutely.
And this show in Watchmen had the potential to do that,
Mm-hmm.
and it was squandered. And I think Misha Green even posted on Twitter back when it was Twitter some of their plans for season 2, which would have been interesting to see how they did that. It would have been messy, but they would have gone fast forwarded, and they would have had the country broken down into like the black freed lands, like these white lands, and like
Oh, cool.
indigenous lands, and there would have been zombies and all this other stuff.
That's
But I'm not going
amazing.
to tell you how it happens because I want people to watch it, so you got to watch the last episode yourselves.
Yeah, figure it out.
If people are looking to buy your merch, where can they buy that at?
Well, before we do that, we have to talk about what we're going to talk about next week.
I forgot what it was.
That's fine. If you want to talk to me about the episode we're talking about next week, which is going to be Forever Night, because
Nicholas.
it's Forever Night, man. I can't even apologize for it. It's bad, and it's vampires, and it's amazing, and I want to see. I've not watched it since the '90s, so I'm deeply interested in how well this is going to go for me.
But you've got Skanky there. What could go wrong?
This show is the reason why I wanted to play a vampire DJ character in Masquerade for so long, because this show. Um, we're gonna watch episodes 1 and 2 because they're both kind of the pilot, Dark Knight 1 and 2. Season 1, episode 1, 2, and season 6, Dying to Know You. And if you are wanting to talk to me about Forever Night or any other bad vampire show, because I've probably watched it or at least Googled it, you can find me right now on Blue Sky is the main social media place to find me. Find me at pugsteady.com, which is also my website. I have, at this point in time, pretty much abandoned Elon Muskville to its non-block horrible regime. But really, if you want to talk to me, the best place to talk to me is probably the Darker Hue Discord, where you can find me talking about really obscure Japanese role-playing games right now.
If you're looking for me if you're looking for my stuff, you could go buy Harlem Unbound second edition from the Chaosium website. or at any of your local friendly gaming stores. And if they don't have it, you should tell them to order you a copy and stock more copies of it. If
Indeed.
you're just looking for me online, I'd say go to Blue Sky or come into the Discord, where I'm still posting the occasional what I consider to be funny memes.
I think they're funny too. I think you're funny. But with that, whether you think Chris is funny or not, we will see you next week where we talk about forever.